Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Welcome to episode 47. I'm Emily Kircher-Morse, and today we're going to talk about talking. Communication is a skill kids begin learning basically at birth, but it gets increasingly more complicated along the way, and many times gifted kids need more opportunities to talk to like-minded peers about topics that are important to them. We'll talk about why that is and what we can do about it with Dr. Jean Peterson. Stay with us. I'd like to send a big thank you to some new patrons who've committed to keeping Mind Matters moving along. Thank you to Helen, Troy, Kristen, and Jacob. You've decided to make a monthly contribution through Patreon, and we really appreciate it. It goes a long way to defraying some of the expense of producing this content. Thank you so much. Other ways that you can help include giving us a thumbs up, or writing a review on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find Mind Matters. Coming up next.
I'm Jean Peterson, Professor Emerita from Purdue University. I'll get to talk today about Get Gifted Students Talking.
Stay where you are.
Previously on Mind Matters.
AP is about as close as we've got at a large scale to a gifted and talented program for high school students. The exposure to college level content and rigor and teaching and assignments.
There's not necessarily that barrier of testing into the program.
AP in many high schools was what they call a gated program. You had to have a teacher recommendation or a certain grade point average or score on something in order to be admitted. Most of those barriers, not everywhere, but most of those barriers have fallen, and most high schools, including now many high schools that serve disadvantaged kids, are encouraging students to at least attempt an AP class. A lot of issues here. It's a huge topic. It's going to be one of the big challenges ahead for AP, but it's also going to be one of the big challenges ahead for American education.
Look for episode 42 wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
On today's episode, we have Jean Peterson, who authored a book in a series called Talk with Teens, and her newly revised book is called Get Gifted Students Talking. For the record, I have both the previous version and the new version.
No kidding.
I do. Free Spirit sent me a version to check out before it was released, and so your book is one that I use often in my practice when I'm having conversations with gifted kids. But before we dig into some of your ideas, I just want to start by asking, what do you make of this idea that gifted kids are better equipped and therefore don't need support or propping up?
Well, as a researcher, I've studied, I guess, the findings in my studies. Several studies have shown that we have a lot to be concerned about. And there's a lot that's hidden. Gifted kids are good at hiding their concerns, for one thing. Even, when I've studied high achievers, pure and simple, sometimes I will study underachievers and high achievers. But when I've studied even high achievers, there's so much stuff going on in their lives. I had a study called Negative Life Events, and how that can affect the gifted kids' lives, not just their achievement, but their lives and their well-being. I did that study about negative life events because I had done a study that showed the change when an underachiever turns things around before they finish high school, or when they become an underachiever after being a high achiever. What is it that goes on in their lives? It was just amazing how much stuff is going on in the lives that could upend anybody. And as a counselor, basically that's what I do and have done, is work with gifted kids who are happy to have a place where they can talk about things that are really troubling them, where they're really struggling, sometimes scarily, sometimes with suicidal ideation. Certainly depression is not uncommon, and lots of anxiety. So that's what counselors are likely to see when they work with gifted kids. I spent 25 years as a teacher, 20 in the classroom. That's where I became interested in the social and emotional challenges for gifted kids. And I'm glad for what those kids taught me and what I learned through what they said in response to literature, for instance, and in their writing. I never assigned personal writing per se, but as they responded to literature, for instance, I learned there was just a whole bunch of stuff going on. So this idea that we can be confident that gifted kids will be fine on their own, I would say let's be cautious about, saying things like that.
So in this book, you provide resources and topics to facilitate these discussions with gifted kids and so that they can talk to their peers as well. What do you think is the reason that it's so important for gifted kids to have those opportunities to talk with similar peers about, topics related to identity and stress and all of the things that kind of they're dealing with in their lives?
They need an opportunity to come out from behind whatever image protection they have. There's a lot going on, and they are hiding fears and doubts and worries about the future, worries about the present. Gifted kids come from all sorts of families, all sorts of economic, social situations. We certainly shouldn't assume that everything is fine and dandy. They also need to normalize what they're going through, in a sense. Their life is unique, and we should never invalidate their experiences by saying, other kids are having this too, and therefore. But they also need to have a place to learn what they have in common. I used to have the kids, when I was running maybe 10 groups a week with gifted kids, and at the end, I would just have them write a paragraph saying, why did you keep coming? It was voluntary. Why did you keep coming? They would say things like, I might not have made it through this year without group. And then they would say something like, I didn't know other kids were having the same struggles as I have been. Developmental struggles. I have had people ask me, like, what do you mean developmental struggles? Well, I'm talking about figuring out who we are, where we're going, about how to do relationships, how to learn to be autonomous. Those kinds of developmental tasks, we have to keep revisiting them in a way across the lifespan. But those things should be normalized for them. Otherwise, with all the hypersensitivity that goes into being gifted and intensity and interests and things, they need a chance to find out how normal they are, that they are not crazy. I've had so many kids say, I just feel crazy. I just feel like I can't shut off my head at night. I'm really, really worried about myself, things like that. I'm going to throw in here one thing that the Gifted Ed Resource Institute here at Purdue, there was a study that a doctoral student did of the summer programs, which use this book, by the way, in this idea of small group discussion. And the kids come from, at that year that they did the study, I think they came from 13 countries and about 5 Native American tribes. And the kids, again, were interviewed and wrote down some things. And a big theme was that they were kind of excited to know that kids all over the world basically struggle with growing up. And I thought, that's what it's about. Mm-hmm. They had normalized what they were going through and the connections they made in the groups. And they were groups of 6, 7, 8 people facilitated by young adults that I was able to train. Those kids carried over to their recreational time the relationships that they were developing in the groups. So there was a carryover too. And the kids that came back another year said that they had applied what they learned in their peer relationships back home.
I know that a lot of times kids may feel uncomfortable with that group dynamic. They might prefer a one-on-one conversation. But what is it about that group dynamic? I know you mentioned the normalization. I don't know if there's other things that you would also add to that.
It's kind of a cliche in the counseling world that social problems should be solved socially. Mm-hmm. In other words, you can't do one-on-one counseling effectively, probably, to resolve the situation of bullying, for instance. If you're talking to just one kid, either the bully or the victim or the target, there's a whole different dynamic, I think you use that word, the group dynamic, that offers a social setting. There can be feedback then from peers, different perspectives, different insights that are shared in the group that they're not even going to be in a book necessarily. They need to hear the me too about concerns, about doubts, about fears. In a group, kids are not just talking with a counselor, they are listening to kids like them. And I really do believe that gifted kids should be grouped together because they really, from my experiences, they do not believe that anybody can understand them.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful to see how their shoulders will relax and they lean in. And as they hear other people, talking, these are real conversations.
Right.
Conflict can be talked about. Hot button issues can be talked about in a safe place.
And it's a really delicate balance when encouraging a kid, especially one who is introverted or shy or has anxieties and fears, to jump into a group and give this a try. It's risky because you can sacrifice some of the trust you've built with them if it goes wrong. What do you do in that situation?
First of all, I assure anybody that nobody will be under pressure to speak. And I really try to stick to that. I don't ever insist that anybody speak, even during a go-around when you ask one question and everybody responds. Doing that once or twice a session is important because it's going to encourage people who are shy to just say one little thing. But I also emphasize that they can pass. All they have to say is pass. And I clarify that that's no big deal. It just means that, well, I don't know about that. It isn't a comfortable topic for me to comment on, something like that. So the no pressure to speak is one thing. And the other thing that I find useful in the book, there are activity sheets that just ask for little brief 2-3 word responses or 1-word responses. And they can hold that in front of them. I usually have people around a table, so they put it on the table in front of them and we do a go around and everybody, all they have to do is just read the response. And kids have told me afterwards, the shyest kids have said, I was really glad we had the activity sheets because I didn't have to think of what to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think other ways to help them to feel comfortable, you can certainly talk about introversion and extroversion sometime. If you're talking about personality types or whatever, that is one way to just kind of normalize differences. But I like to reframe shyness. What is it to be quiet and reticent and reluctant to speak? Well, there's an advantage to that. I always say shy people are probably way better at observing than kids that are the most talkative. And the kids who are most talkative may not be learning as much, therefore, as kids who are shy. And then we might discuss that. So what are the advantages of being quiet?
Some kids, maybe if they're shy or maybe more introverted, they might lack some social skills because if you don't socialize as often or as deeply as your peers, you might not have the opportunity to learn those things. Groups can be a way to help that as well, to teach them the art of small talk.
When the kids are settling in, just coming in, finding a chair, sitting down, that's a time for small talk. And I tried to do that even as a classroom teacher, to stand in the hall by the door and just greet kids as they came in. How you doing? Or, so how did that turn out yesterday? You can just kind of touch base. So those are ways to engage them. And it's funny, I would say that I never had trouble with the shy kids. Even if they didn't say a lot, they were the most faithful in some cases. They didn't want to miss. So they were getting something out of it, some sort of a social pull that kept them coming.
One of the issues gifted kids often deal with is the "who am I?" question. Your book talks a little about helping them develop their own identities. What are some of the ways we can go about that? Like, what are some of the questions we should ask them or suggest they ask themselves?
How are you similar and how are you unique? And, what does gifted mean? What kind of stereotypes are there about bright kids? And then how do you fit the stereotype and how do you not fit the stereotype? That usually is one of the best conversations that we have in a whole series. What about learning preferences? That's an interesting one. Are you more than your test scores and your grades? What about conformity? On a scale of 1 to 10, I like to use scaling questions now and then. How much do you conform? Who are your encouragers in your life? Who are the discouragers in your life? That also is usually a very good conversation. How able are you to play? Sometimes I think gifted kids don't get enough practice at that. There's a session that usually is in my books. It's an outline of a novel that is at the top. It says something like being an interesting story. They have to put a title on their life. They have to put 5 chapters, each with a title. Who are the heroes? Who's the best neighbor ever? Who are the evil ones? Who are the angels? What's the most dramatic memory? And I've never had anybody be indiscreet about that one, by the way. When have you needed courage? What matters to you? It's a discussion of values. And then lonely at the top. That could be a leader. It could be just super, super bright. Is there a loneliness that goes with being at the top? Maybe it's in a talent area or something like that. So those are all about helping them articulate and think about who they are. And everybody, I'm in retirement and I'm still, sometimes I'm fascinated by that. Friends are usually retirees now. We're all figuring out who we are still, trying on new hats in a way, and trying new things. And that's what goes on during the school years. Kids are figuring out who they are.
What about relationships? I feel like that's a big thing with gifted kids, is friendships or even romantic relationships. What are some of the things that you hear bright kids talking about when it comes to that might be different than their peers?
Well, maybe every kid believes that nobody can really understand them. So they're hesitant to initiate conversations and to initiate relationships, maybe. Some of them are well-balanced socially and all of that. It's no problem. I try to always emphasize being able to give compliments and receive compliments. Those are 2 big skills that gifted kids sometimes have trouble with. But they worry that, is somebody genuine when they give you a compliment? Do they want something? Or am I just being, played with here? I believe they often worry about being too much, too loud, too passionate, too emotional, too upset, too fragile. They worry about that, and they worry about how that would fit in a friendship group or in a relationship. And sometimes they get strong messages, negative messages about that, that their complicated mind will scare away people. One of the reasons I like to focus on developmental topics, like about growing up, because those are common, at least, unique to the population and the culture and all of that. But if you stick to the developmental topics, good things will happen. Some of them worry about what to say. Some think they have to be great all the time. Some of them are possessive of friends and unwilling to share them. They overthink. Some of them don't want any friend to come home with them because they're embarrassed about where they come from. And that's a sad reality. So the groups give kids a chance to meet meaningfully and to talk and interact meaningfully without needing to perform and not needing to compete and not needing to be graded. That's kind of what I say about group work.
I use the prompts in your book often at my practice. It's a real natural fit for me, but for school counselors or teachers, it can be really helpful for them too. Would you recommend forming groups in a school setting? And if so, what might the challenges of that be?
If they're being organized in school, you have to think through the logistics before you probably even approach the administration. It's not easy to get administrators on board because you need a space. In my opinion, it should be a smaller room than a classroom because of the sense of intimacy and trust and the less likelihood that somebody's going to come in to get something in the room. That's very important because privacy is so important for trust. And without trust, groups don't function very well and they don't function optimally. You have to figure out then how to do public relations with the teachers, with all players in the school, all stakeholders. What is the purpose? This is not just hanging out. It's very hard to justify just hanging out. That's not what these are about. This is a very kind of a packed full meeting, whether it's 30 minutes or 55 minutes. The length of time varies according to age, of course. Ethics has to be considered. What are you going to say about ethics to parents? You obviously need to communicate with parents after this is in place. This way of dealing with small groups has been studied now. 3 studies have shown that it works. It has good outcomes.
But then for everything, there's an end.
Yes.
So when you wrap up a group, you've covered what you want to discuss and progress has been made, but now it's time to disband. How do kids take that? And how do you manage it?
Usually as part of that, they will probably take a little 10-item survey, how comfortable they felt and whether the facilitator, what kind of a job the facilitator did, how many people they felt that they know better or something like that. But in the narrative, asking for a paragraph, I've never had anybody speak negatively in all of that time. And I've dealt with some pretty high-risk kids as well as, bright and bushy-tailed, highly successful students. It has always amazed me how they mesh together when they talk about development. Socioeconomic stuff dissolves away. Cultural differences, they can be in rival gangs. If they're in a small group, they will get to know each other developmentally, and they will not be the same when they finish. That's always been the case. That's why I keep at it. This is a really good way to connect kids. If I were younger, I might try to take this as a way to remedy some of the divisiveness that seems to be talked about a lot in the media. When I was running 100 kids a week, just gifted kids in a large high school, I was told by the administrators that they felt that the groups actually had helped the school climate be better. I never knew exactly what they meant, but I got that feedback quite a bit. So it can have a more macro effect. But certainly kids have told me that they just couldn't believe how good it was to be in a group and to get to know kids.
Dr. Jean Peterson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here and honored to be here.
The kids in my freshman gifted class and I had a goal pretty much every day in class. It was to see how long we could take our teacher off topic, following tangent after tangent, pushing off any work as long as possible. We thought we were really sneaky about the whole thing, too, although perhaps it was our teacher who was the sneaky one. When I was a teacher in a middle school gifted program, giving my students the space to explore ideas of identity and relationships in life was a highlight of my day. The psychologist Irvin Yalom identified the 4 main human struggles with existentialism within the 4 topics of isolation, meaninglessness, mortality, and freedom. Gifted kids are more likely to begin facing these topics earlier than their peers, and there is nothing more powerful to overcome these fears than a feeling of universality, knowing that we aren't isolated and that other people are with us together. Bright kids are as different from each other as any other group of kids. But there are commonalities that make finding time for allowing them to talk to each other valuable. Structuring groups in the way Jean suggests in her book fosters the openness to experience personality trait that many gifted individuals have. Hearing others' points of view builds empathy and perspective-taking, giving us a chance to connect with the world around us and understanding our relationships with others from a different viewpoint. It can reduce feelings of isolation gifted kids may feel if they struggle to connect with their peers, and help gifted kids feel more comfortable sharing their experiences. Most of life is about finding our place, finding our flock, and getting gifted kids talking is one of the best ways we can help them. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on Mind Matters.
Our thanks to Dr. Jean Peterson, whose work has been vital to the gifted community. We appreciate her time today. Thanks to the many folks we've been lucky enough to meet on our recent travels, and all of our new friends who now follow us on social media. On Twitter, it's @MindMattersPod, and Mind Matters Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. For Emily and our mascot, Cooper, I'm executive producer Dave Morris. See you next time, because we've got things to talk about. Mind Matters is a Morris Creative Services production.